Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the first in a pair of lessons um, which are going to be another painting in progress series. So I think I did one painting in progress video a few terms ago or a term ago, which had a look at a landscape painting that I was working on. So with these videos I use them as a way to look at my process in my own professional work. So a lot of the videos are obviously designed to give you guys an exercise that you can work within, and these ones are a little bit different in that they're more kind of looking at a professional process or an aspect of my professional practice. So this one's a still life painting, and it's part of a series that I'm working on for a show, a solo exhibition in New York in a month or so. It's actually the final one that I've been working on, and all of them are this sort of piece with objects hovering in front of a wall, and they're essentially, they fit into a category of painting called trompe-l'oeil, which means trick of the eye in French. So the idea behind them is that this particular series is that the objects feel like they're hovering sort of in a space beyond the surface of the canvas because of the shadow. Trompe-l'oeil can take different forms, so it could be, you can do trompe-l'oeil that's a relief. If you've seen things like the Sistine ceiling or other ceiling frescoes in Europe, you'll know that those often have kind of architectural elements or perspective elements that make it seem like the roof is open up to the sky, or it's continuing beyond the physical space that it's in. But basically it's an illusion, so using this sort of technique, this particular design, this kind of shallow field and shadows, you can create a sense that the object is hovering, like you could put your hand behind it basically. This one's in a very early stage, or relatively early stage, so I've sketched in my kind of underdrawing, then painted the background in shadow, then I've done one single pass, sort of an hour or so, just really kind of roughing in the just zoom in here a bit, see if I can get it to refocus. Change my focus. Nope. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be doing kind of dynamic focusing, unfortunately. Zoom back out. But hopefully you got some idea of how it looked. Just drop that down again. So yeah, as you can see, it's fairly kind of roughly painted in, using quite reasonably broad brush strokes. So this is a nest that the egg is hovering above, in case you hadn't gathered that. So ultimately the nest will be a lot finer, so the little strands of twigs and dry grass will be a lot kind of more detailed and fine. This is just blocked in, so if you blow your eyes it'll kind of roughly feel the same as it will ultimately. But during these two demonstrations, so I'm going to do two demonstrations I think. So the first one's going to be just looking at how I work this egg to a kind of pretty much a finished point, and then the second one will be looking at how I go about kind of creating the right kind of texture and level of detail in this nest in the foreground as well. But yeah, so we can begin with the egg. I'm not going to go kind of too heavily into materials that you would need, because it's not exactly a paint-along lesson, this one. It's more about kind of looking at my process and thinking about when you're working on your own things, how do you problem solve. So I'll go through what I'm thinking as I'm working and what I'm using, but it's not too prescriptive. You wouldn't need to work exactly the same way if you're doing your own thing. But once you get to this sort of point in a painting, so everything's blocked in, it's kind of loosely there, but it's obviously not refined. At least certainly for me, it's not refined to the level that I need it to be for this series. So I kind of need to think about what's not working, what feels not refined enough. So one thing is it's maybe a little bit too patchy, this egg. There's a little bit of the ground still showing through where I don't necessarily want it. The form doesn't quite feel super accurate. So I'm working with a photo reference that I'll just swivel around to. So there's the egg on my tablet. So I want to kind of look for some of the more subtle color transitions. Probably also want to deepen the shadow a bit. Which means to make those sorts of decisions, the first thing I want to do is I want to oil in the image a bit. So I think I've spoken about oiling in before, but when you've painted something and you've allowed it to dry, you'll hopefully notice that if I just kind of glaze over with a little bit of my medium, well, it's not too sunken in actually. Now sometimes when it's really badly sunken in, you'll get a kind of more of a lift, increase in contrast when you just brush over a little bit of your medium. But this one's not actually too bad, so I maybe had quite a bit of oil in my original mix. But when you kind of pick up where you left off on a painting, you want to make sure it's fully oiled in, because if you imagine you have something that's kind of greyed because it's dried and it's gone more dull, then you try to match that value with your new paint. When you revarnish it, the thing that's greyed will go back to being a rich colour and the other one will stay the colour that it is, and you'll end up with something quite patchy. So the other thing I want to think about when working over something that could be wet as I work through it. So if I'm going to spend, in this session I'm going to split it into two, but I'm going to be working on the egg and then the nest subsequently. If I started working on the nest first in this instance, the nest would be a bit wet, and then I'd start to kind of go up and try to work on the egg. And if I want to be able to rest my hand on the canvas, which in this case I can because everything's dry as it is, I'd end up smudging the painting below. So generally it's a good idea, I find, to work from top to bottom in any given session. So all your wetter sections are above your hand, so your hand can keep resting as it moves down the surface of the canvas. So yeah, that's just a little tip. But let's get going. So I'll just walk you through my thought process as I go. So one thing I feel is the colour's slightly off. I want to go for something a bit more kind of like a warmer green, so it's a little bit too cool. The egg is one of those kind of I guess duck egg blue seems pretty accurate for it. But yeah, that kind of almost duck egg quality. When I first blocked this in, I wasn't entirely happy with the colour of the egg, so that's something I just want to work on today. But I am happy with the shape of the egg. That's accurate. So I don't want to alter the shape too much. So I'm just working within the boundaries that I've already established. I'm working with a small brush because I'm going for a finish. So when I was blocking in, I was using a bigger brush because it's faster. But once you get to a point where you want things to near completion, you want to switch to well, if you want to add detail, should we say, you want to switch to a smaller brush. So as I gradually go down this edge, I'm working on the left edge, just following that rule I was talking about to make it less likely that I smudge anything that I've worked on. As I work down, I'm making it kind of gradually darker, the paint. the central form of the egg is the darkest part, the lightest part, sorry. So as we move down it gets progressively darker. But quite subtly, and each time I'm mixing a new kind of gradually color. I'm just going to swap back to this left hand edge. So I'm kind of working all the way around these darker halftones. I'm going to gradually start pulling in closer to the center of the egg. Eggs are a really great subject matter actually for learning. They're a very even form. If you paint from one of those more kind of creamy eggs or darker eggs, they can match quite a spectrum of skin tones. So as a kind of warm-up or an exercise when it comes to painting portraits, they're really useful. Don't know if there are many people with a kind of greeny yellow skin tone like this, but you never know. I also want to go in and just darken this shadow a bit. I wasn't entirely happy when I painted it. Felt a little bit washed out. So I'm pretty much kind of glazing, which is thinly painting a darker colour over a lighter colour. So I've got this kind of reflected greenish hue, which I'm not crazy about actually. It doesn't quite fit the kind of colour profile of the whole painting. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time fiddling with that as I carry on reworking this egg. This stage is a lot easier than the first pass, in that everything's already kind of approximately established. So you're not altering you're not kind of shifting the value or the color too drastically in any way. You have a good foundation to work from. Which makes it a lot easier. So I want to build some more of that reflected light back in. It's important to have this reflected light, particularly kind of this down facing section, this section that faces towards the nest, because the nest has some light aspects which would be bouncing a little bit back up. That's not too bad. So I'll return back to the light of the egg, and I want to start kind of really subtly feeding these darker halftones into the kind of mid halftones, and I want to get that transition at the bedbug line. So this line here that separates light from dark, I want to get that to work a little bit better before I turn to the lights. Transitioning from the kind of the mid half tones to the light half tones and the highlights is generally easier and kind of less important than these transitions out of the bedbug line. So I talk about this a lot in other lessons as well, but you'll be able to see how important it is. You know, when I'm working on it in the context of my own work, it's something I'm really, really aware of. It's something I pay a lot of attention to. It really does make a big difference. So I'm quite happy with those transitions now. I'm going to have to work, starting to creep quite close to kind of the end of where I've worked today. When I say the end, I mean kind of the end of the wet paint. So because I'm reaching the end of that, I need to push the mid halftones out a little bit. To give myself a bit more breadth for these subtle transitions. The other thing you might notice is I'm trying to not blend an enormous amount, so I'm not necessarily blending loads. I'm mixing new values and painting them on in kind of bands. We could call them planes. So I'll switch back to my kind of mid half tone colour. Start patching that in. I'm going to be working over the top of it a bit anyway, so I don't have to be super accurate with it. Eggs are an interesting form to work with because they're amorphous and very specific at the same time. I'm going to start lightening my values a bit, but try and keep the hue, which is the specific color that the egg is. The hue and to a certain extent the chroma. So the chroma is how sort of saturated the color is, the specific color. But generally you also want to try to make sure the chroma kind of increases. I'm just going to fill in the center of the egg. It's kind of, eggs have this sort of specularity. Specularity is how shiny or dull the surface is. They have a specularity which is quite kind of muted, and that's why they're quite like skin. So skin, unless it's wet, so unless the skin's sweaty or wet for some reason, it won't be particularly shiny. It'll have like a dull sheen, and eggs have a similar sort of dull sheen as well. So I'm just adding a tiny bit of a kind of lighter center. So while I don't want it to be shiny, I do want just a little bit of a lift in the center of the egg here. It's not too bad. So switch back to my slightly dimmer color, and then start working on kind of feeding these halftones together. So you can see there's this sort of band at the moment, and it won't take too long or too much effort to just soften out that transition. also trying to break the color a little bit, so I did a lesson a little while ago about broken color, so I'm adding some kind of slightly bluer colors as I'm feeding it in. Just to give the eggshell surface a bit more ambiguity and vibrancy. Particularly in these slightly darker halftones. There we go, so you see it's kind of just come together at this point. So the transition's evened out. Smooth over with my fingers. Sometimes the brush strokes can get a little bit too built up, which they were starting to just there, so it becomes a bit too kind of scratchy looking almost. So you can see these changes, they're subtle. Particularly if you were to skip back to the beginning of the video, you'll see there's been quite a change, but it feels, because it's kind of gradual, it doesn't feel super substantial what we've done. But as you paint, you want kind of your ultimate goal with the painting in mind. So I can have a picture of the egg. Obviously I've got my reference, but I've also just got, you know, the kind of brushwork that I want it to feature. How much I want it to pop out. All that sort of stuff in my mind at the same time. So starting to get there, not too far off being reasonably happy. Obviously, with anything that you work on, you're kind of gauging whether you've reached the level of finish that you're after. Obviously, I could keep infinitely smoothing this particular egg, but at some point I have to decide that what I have is what I was going for, and then move on to another part of the painting. And ultimately that'll be, you know, how the egg is in the final painting. And being efficient with your work. If you tend towards being a bit of a perfectionist, which a lot of people do, is being able to kind of say that you're done. Which I'm quite close to, I think, with this egg. Just about there. I'd always have the opportunity, if I wanted to do another pass, and I'm trying to avoid it with this one, so I want it to be about at the level of finish that I'm going for ultimately. Just add a little bit more. Light to the center of the form. That's not too bad. So that just made quite a big difference, adding just that little lift to the center of the form. It just feels just the right texture now, and before it felt a little bit flat. So as I say, they're minor, these adjustments that you make when you're working at this sort of level of detail, but they can make a really big difference ultimately. One last thing, I was about to stop, but I did actually just notice something I'd like to work on, which is just ever so slightly softening this transition at the bedbug line. Yeah, it's not too bad. happy with that. So I'll leave the egg at that, and then next week we'll be picking up where we left off, and we'll be working in the nest. But yeah, hopefully makes a bit of a difference what we've done today. Hopefully you feel like the egg floats better. We might pop back up to it, and we'll see, maybe at the end of the next session when we've worked on the nest. But yeah, we'll give a little bit of space and then go back to it if need be. But I'm reasonably happy with how it is. And yeah, that's it. So as always, if you want to follow us on YouTube, just click subscribe. And if you want to join the OCAD Studio course and get guidance from myself and other tutors via Skype alongside, so you can kind of work on all these tutorial videos and then get feedback on your work and really improve quickly, just follow the link through to OCAD's course page. But yeah, I'll see you guys next week.